I've been alone for 10 years. That was the sentence. 6 words, spoken low, in a kitchen that smelled of black coffee and wood smoke, on a Tuesday evening in October of 1889, in a small stone ranch house 4 miles south of Silver Creek, Colorado. She said it looking at the tabletop, not at him, and the tabletop was pine, and the pine had a scar in it shaped like a river. He heard the sentence and did not answer, because there was no answer that would fit inside it. He only nodded once, slow, and reached for the coffee pot as if the reaching itself was a form of listening. Outside the window, the San Juan Range was already going blue with dusk, and a single cottonwood, half stripped of its gold, ticked at the glass whenever the wind touched it. That was the moment the story turned. Everything before it had been the long approach. Everything after would be the answer he did not yet know how to give. Ethan Calloway was 34 years old that autumn, born in Pueblo in the spring of 1855, raised on cattle and quiet, and by his own reckoning a man of no particular gift except patience. He stood 6 feet even, lean the way ranch work makes a man lean, with dark brown hair cut short against the collar and a beard kept close for the cold. His eyes were the pale gray of creek water in November. He had been a widower for 2 years, since the fever winter of 1887 took his wife Sarah at 29 and left him 160 acres of good grazing land, 41 head of cattle, and a house too large by half. He did not speak much of Sarah, and he did not speak much of anything, but the fence line along the north pasture had been mended board by board in the 2 years since she died, and the porch had been rebuilt and the barn reshingled, and if a man could grieve in wood and nails, Ethan Calloway had built a chapel of it. His brother Silas, older by 3 years, ran a smaller place outside Pueblo and wrote him a letter every second month, always ending with the same line. "Come home when the ache lets you. There is a place at this table for you." Ethan kept those letters in a tin box beneath his bed, unanswered but not unread. He had loved Sarah plainly. He did not carry a photograph of her in his vest pocket, because he had learned in the first year after she died that a photograph is a small hard object that can be lost, and he could not risk the losing. Instead he had learned by heart the shape of her hands folding a piece of bread dough, and the way she stood in the doorway at dusk when he came in from the pasture, and the sound of her voice saying his name from the next room. Those were the pieces he kept. Those were the pieces the tin box beneath the bed could not hold and could not lose. Miriam Hayes was 31 that October, and she had lived in the small stone house at the end of the wagon road since she was 21. Her hair was chestnut brown, coiled into a low knot at the nape of her neck, and her eyes were dark hazel and steady. She wore, that evening as most evenings, a long-sleeved gray wool dress buttoned to the throat, a white apron over it, and her mother's silver locket at her collar. Her husband Thomas had ridden out one morning in the spring of 1879 to drive a small herd north to the railhead at Durango, and he had not come back. There had been a storm, and there had been a river, and there had been a search that lasted 11 days, and at the end of the 11 days there was nothing. She had waited 7 full years before she stopped setting his place at the table. She had waited 3 more before she said, on a Tuesday in October, "I've been alone for 10 years. Between the setting down of the second plate and the saying out loud of the 6 words, she had learned to be a woman who could split her own kindling, doctor her own hens, patch her own roof after a spring hailstorm, and never once ask the town for pity. That skill had cost her something she could not name, and the not naming of it had cost her more. There was a small wooden box on the top shelf of her wardrobe with 3 items in it. A folded letter Thomas had written her from a cattle camp outside Pagosa in the second summer of their marriage, a plain gold wedding band no longer worn, and a lock of dark hair the color of Thomas's hair, tied with a scrap of blue thread. She opened the box twice a year, on the anniversary of the storm and on Christmas Eve, and she did not open it any other time, and this was a discipline she had built the way another woman might build a fence, and she was not about to unbuild it without cause. The town of Silver Creek sat in a bowl between 2 ridges, for 180 souls by the last count, 1 church, 1 schoolhouse, 1 general store run by a widow named Cora Bell, and a saloon nobody talked about on Sundays. It was the kind of town where people knew one another's cattle by the shape of the horns, and one another's grief by the length of it. Miriam's grief, everyone agreed, had gone on long enough. That was the town's opinion, not Miriam's. She had never asked for their opinion, and they had never bothered to keep it to themselves. Ethan had first come to her stone house 18 months earlier, in the April of 1888, for the plain purpose of buying eggs. Miriam kept a flock of 20 Rhode Island Reds and sold their eggs at 4 cents apiece, and Ethan had ridden the 4 miles from his place because his own hens had gone off laying and he could not stomach breakfast without them. She had counted out a dozen into a straw-lined tin, taken his 48 cents and said, "Tuesday next if you're wanting more." He had said Tuesday then. That had been the beginning of it. Every Tuesday for 18 months, in rain and in the low blue cold of January and in the yellow blaze of high summer, Ethan Calloway had ridden 4 miles for a dozen eggs he could have bought at Cora Bell's for 5 cents. Neither of them had said a word about that arithmetic. That was the shape of the thing. Word travels fast in a bowl between 2 ridges. By the fall of 1888, Cora Bell at the general store had begun to say, whenever Miriam came in, "How's your Tuesday, man?" And Miriam would pretend not to hear. Reverend Amos Whitfield, 62 and kind, had begun to include in his Sunday prayers a small, general thanksgiving for the quiet friendships that ripen slow. Lord, in your good time. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Hannah Doyle who boarded with Miriam 3 nights a week, had taken to leaving the second coffee cup out on the sideboard on Tuesday mornings before she left for the schoolhouse, without a word because she had eyes. And Jesse Coombs, 28, a decent horseman who ran 200 acres east of town and had asked Miriam gently, twice in the last 2 years whether she would consider walking out with him, had begun to understand that the answer, when it came, would not be his. There was, in other words, a chorus. Silver Creek had, without permission, cast itself as the audience of a small quiet play, and the 2 actors on the stage were the last to know they were in it. Hannah Doyle, 24 and forthright when it suited her, had told Miriam once in the kitchen, drying a plate, "You know he comes on Tuesdays because Tuesday is the only day of the week that has your name on it in his head." Miriam had said, "Hannah," and Hannah had said, "I'm only stating what a person with eyes can see." And Miriam had put down her drying cloth and looked out the window at nothing in particular, and had not answered, and Hannah, who had eyes, had said no more. A week later, in Cora Bell's general store, Cora had counted out a pound of coffee into a paper bag and said, without looking up from the scale, "Miriam, when a man rides 4 miles for eggs he does not need, he is either lost or found. Ethan Calloway has not been lost since he was 14 years old. I have known him that long. You may take that for what it is worth." Miriam had said, "Cora," and Cora had said, I know, I am only counting the coffee." And she had gone on counting. That was the setting. The evening of the sentence unfolded, as most Tuesday evenings had for a year and a half, in the plain and unhurried way of things that repeat themselves. Ethan rode up the wagon road at the last hour of the afternoon, his gray mare Willow slow with the mile. He tied her to the rail beside the stone house, took off his hat as he stepped onto the porch, and knocked twice, though he had not knocked in 6 months. Miriam opened the door in her long gray dress and her white apron, and her hair was down that evening, brushed but not yet pinned, which he had never seen. He looked at the floor. She looked at the floor. He came in. The kitchen was warm. She had baked bread that afternoon. There was a pot of stew on the range with venison and potatoes and a smaller pot of coffee ready, and 2 cups already on the table, and this was new. He noticed the 2 cups and did not remark on them. He set his hat on the hook. He sat down. She poured. He drank. Outside, the cottonwood ticked at the window. For a long time neither of them spoke, and the not speaking was not awkward. It was the same not speaking they had shared for 18 months, only tonight it had a different weight, the way a room feels different when someone has moved a table without telling you. Then she said it. "I've been alone for 10 years. He set down his cup. He did not look at her, and she did not look at him. He said, at last, yes. She said, "I'm not asking for anything." He said, "I know." She said, "I only wanted to say it out loud once. To someone who wasn't going to hand me a piece of pity." He said that was a fair thing to want. Then the silence came back, and it was not the same silence as before. It had the shape of a question that neither of them was yet brave enough to name. He rode home that night in the full dark, and he did not sleep, and in the morning he did what he had always done when a thing was too large to hold in words. He built. It was the first physical labor of that October. Ethan Calloway rode over to Miriam's stone house the following Thursday, not a Tuesday, which Hannah Doyle noticed from the schoolhouse window, and he brought with him in the wagon bed a sawhorse, a hand plane, a coping saw, a box of iron nails, and 11 planed pine boards he had cut down himself from a windfall behind his barn. Miriam was in the yard scattering feed to the reds when he came up the road. She looked at the wagon and at him and said only, "The chicken run?" And he said, "The chicken run." The chicken run was the piece of her yard that had, for 2 years, been fenced with a patchwork of chicken wire and old crate slats, sagging at every corner, mended by her own hands whenever it fell, never rebuilt because a woman alone chooses her battles. Ethan tied Willow to the rail, took off his coat, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and worked from mid-morning to sundown without speaking more than the words the work required. He did not eat the noon meal she offered him. He drank the coffee she brought out. He replaced every rotten post and every sagging board, squared the corners with a level he had brought from home, and rebuilt the small gate at the near end so it swung easy and latched clean. When the last board was set, he cleaned his tools, put on his coat, put on his hat, and rode out. He had not said all day why he had come. He had not needed to. That was the way of the thing. That was the answer he had not known how to give in the kitchen. He had given it now in pine and iron, and the chickens went in and out of it, and Miriam stood at her window and watched him ride the 4 miles home, and she did not weep because weeping was not the shape of what she was feeling. She was feeling, for the first time in 10 years, seen. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly builds a chicken run. That night, alone at her table, Miriam did something she had not done in 7 years. She got the small wooden box down from the top shelf of the wardrobe. She opened it. She read Thomas's letter through once, slow, from the salutation to the last line, and she folded it back into its creases. She held the plain gold ring in her palm a while, and then she set it back into the box, and she put the box back on the shelf. She did not weep. She did not need to. Some conversations happen between a woman and a wooden box, and no one else needs to be in the room. November came, and the cottonwoods finished with their gold, and the first snow fell soft on the ridges above Silver Creek. Miriam, who had not been to a Saturday supper at the church in 3 years, went to one that November, and Ethan, who had not been to a Saturday supper at the church in longer than that, was there. They did not sit together. They did not speak across the room. Hannah Doyle sat between them at a long trestle table set with red-checked cloth and blue-rimmed plates, and made small kind conversation with each of them in turn, as if she were a bridge and they were the 2 banks of a slow river. Cora Bell watched from 3 seats down and did not comment, which for Cora Bell was itself a comment. Reverend Whitfield said grace and made a small joke about the venison and did not, for once, mention quiet friendships ripening slow. He was a wise man in his way. He knew when to leave a thing alone. After the supper, in the churchyard, Jesse Coombs came up to Miriam under the bare limbs of the elm by the gate, and he said, "Miriam." She turned. His hat was in his hands. He was a decent man, and he had prepared what he was about to say, and he said it with the plain courage of someone who has practiced a sentence in front of a mirror. "Miriam, I've asked you twice, and I told myself I wouldn't ask you a third. So I won't ask. I'll only say, you know where my place is. If you ever change your mind, the door's open and it'll stay open. And if it doesn't change, then I hope whoever it does open for is worth what you are." She looked at him for a long moment. She saw clearly that he was a good man. She said, "Jesse, you're a fine man. I mean that. There is a woman somewhere in this county who will be very lucky. It just isn't going to be me." He did not step back at once. He stood a full breath longer, and then he said, "Quiet, Miriam. I've watched you carry 10 years by yourself. I don't begrudge the man who gets to help you set it down. I only want to say, if he ever, for one day, forgets what it cost you to say yes at all, you send word to my place. You send word and I'll ride." She heard the cost in that. She nodded once. "I hear you, Jesse." He tipped his hat. He put it back on his head. He walked out to the road, and he did not look back once, which was itself a kind of dignity. Cost him something. That cost was visible in the way he set his shoulders. He carried it out with him. Miriam stood a while under the elm, and Ethan came across the churchyard at his slow, steady pace, and stopped a proper 3 feet from her and said, "Cold night." She said, "Yes." He said, "I saw Jesse." She said, "I know you did." He said, "That was hard on him." She said, "It was." He said, "You did it kindly." She said, "I meant it kindly." He said, "That matters." They stood under the elm for a little longer, not looking at each other, not touching, and the snow came down soft between them, and neither of them moved for what might have been a long time or a short one. Time is uncertain in moments like that. At last he said, "I'll ride behind you home if you'll let me." "The road's dark." She said, "I'd be obliged." He rode Willow behind her wagon the whole 4 miles at a walk. He did not come in. He tipped his hat at the gate and rode on to his own place. That was November. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. In December, Ethan built her a new porch step. The old one had been split for a year. He came on a Wednesday, unannounced, with a plank of oak he had milled himself, and he pried up the split step, cut the oak to fit, planed it smooth, drove the pegs, and left before she came back from town. She found the new step at dusk, and she knew, and she stood on it a long time before she went inside. In January, in the coldest week the county had seen in a decade, when the pipe from her well iced solid and she had been hauling water from the creek in buckets, Ethan appeared at dawn on the third day with a length of hemp-wrapped copper piping and a small iron brazier, and he dug the frozen line up out of the packed snow, and he thawed it, and he wrapped it, and he set the brazier to keep it, and he did not come inside, though she asked him twice. In February he did not come for 2 weeks straight, because his own barn roof had gone in a wind, and he was rebuilding it board by board with his brother Silas riding down from Pueblo to help. Miriam felt those 2 weeks. She had not expected to feel them so plainly. Their absence taught her something the presence had not. She caught herself, on the second Tuesday of that absence, setting out 2 coffee cups at dusk before she remembered, and she left the second cup on the sideboard the rest of the evening, and she looked at it, and she did not put it away. On the Thursday of that second week, Hannah Doyle, home from the schoolhouse and shaking snow off her wool coat in the mudroom, said quietly, "He's rebuilding the barn, Miriam." Silas rode down from Pueblo. "I heard it at the post office." Miriam said, "I know." Hannah said, "You could ride out." Miriam said, "I could." Hannah said, "But you won't." Miriam said, "No. He'd come to me if he could. When he can, he will." Hannah looked at her a long moment and then she said, "Gentle, that is not the sentence of a woman who has been alone for 10 years, Miriam. That is the sentence of a woman who is no longer alone and is only waiting for the barn to be finished." Miriam did not answer. She turned back to the coffee she was pouring. But something in her hand moved a little steadier for the sentence, and later, alone at the paned window at full dark, she stood with her forehead against the cold glass a full minute and let the sentence be the true thing it was, and she went to bed that night for the first time in 10 years without the second pillow set on his side of the mattress, because Hannah was right and Miriam was, at last, allowing herself to know it. And it was in February, at the end of those 2 weeks, on a Saturday when the light was going long and blue over the snow, that the thing came to its own edge. Ethan rode up the wagon road at the last hour of the afternoon, and Miriam was not in the house. She was down by the west boundary of her land, where a low split-rail fence marked the line between her acreage and the county road. A section of the fence had blown out in the same wind that took Ethan's barn, and she was working alone in her long gray dress and her heavy wool coat, trying to set the rails back into the posts, and the rails were too heavy for her, and the snow was too deep, and she had been at it for an hour, and she had not yet cried, but she was close to it, because a thing being too heavy is sometimes the last small weight that breaks the day. Ethan saw her from the road. He rode up. He dismounted. He walked to the fence. He did not offer help. He simply picked up the near rail, fitted it into the post, and moved to the next. She stood a moment and then she came and lifted the other end of the next rail with him, and together they set the fence back into itself, board by board at the west boundary line, in the last light of a February Saturday. When the fence was whole again, they stood on opposite sides of it. He on the county road side, she on her own. Neither of them moved. The San Juan Range was going pink behind him. A single crow called once from the cottonwood behind her, and the crow did not call again. He said, "Miriam." She said, "Yes." He said, "I've been thinking on what you said. In October. In the kitchen. About the 10 years. She said, "I've been thinking on it too." He said, "I didn't know what to say next. That night. I want you to know that. I didn't know because there wasn't a word small enough." She said, "I know." He said, "I've had a word since then. I've been carrying it 4 months. I'd like to say it now if you'll hear it. She said, I'll hear it. He looked at her across the fence, and his pale gray eyes were steady, and his voice was low, and he said, you haven't been alone for 10 years. You've been waiting. There's a difference. And I've been the slowest man in Colorado to see it. I'd like to stop being slow now if you'll have me. She did not speak for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, quiet, come around the fence, Ethan. He came around the fence. He did not kiss her. He took her gloved hand in his gloved hand, and he held it, and that was all. They walked back to the stone house in the blue snow, hand in hand, and the crow this time called twice. They were married the third Sunday in April of 1890, in the small white church at Silver Creek by Reverend Whitfield in front of 47 people, one of whom was Jesse Coombs, who came in a clean coat and sat in the back and clapped honestly when the vows were done and left before the cake was cut, because a good man knows the size of his own goodwill and does not spend it past its worth. Hannah Doyle wept openly. Cora Bell wept privately, into a lace handkerchief she pretended was for her nose. Ethan's brother Silas stood beside him and did not weep at all, but he laughed once, very quietly, when Ethan tripped on the word wedded, and that laugh was, for Silas, the same as weeping. Reverend Whitfield closed the ceremony with a line no one in that church ever forgot. Some couples begin with fire. This one began with a chicken run, a porch step, and a fence in the west pasture. I have watched all three go up. I have never presided over a marriage with more evidence in favor of it. A soft warm laughter went through the pews. Miriam looked down at her small posy of dried spring wildflowers, and Ethan looked at Miriam and did not look away. They moved into the stone house because it was hers and it was older and it had good bones. Ethan sold the larger place 4 miles north to a young family from Denver in May, and he kept the 41 head of cattle and moved them to Miriam's south pasture, and he built, in the summer of 1890, a new room on the east side of the stone house, so that the morning light would come in through a window that faced the sunrise, because Miriam had said once, in passing, that she liked the mornings best. He did not tell her he was building the room for the morning light. He simply built it. She understood. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. They had 2 children. A boy, Thomas, born in the spring of 1891, named without discussion, both of them nodding once when the midwife asked what to write, because some names are simply the right names and do not need a conversation. And a girl, Sarah, born in the autumn of 1893. Thomas grew up long-boned and quiet like his father. Sarah grew up steady and clear-eyed like her mother. They ran the flock of Rhode Island Reds together, the 2 children, and they sold the eggs at 4 cents apiece at Cora Bell's store, and Cora, who was older now and slower, always gave them a peppermint stick each and never charged for it. Hannah Doyle married a lawyer from Durango in 1892 and moved down out of the valley, and she wrote Miriam every 3rd month until the end of her life. Silas Calloway rode down from Pueblo each Christmas with a wagon of gifts he pretended were only for the children, and stayed the week, and read aloud by the wood stove until Thomas fell asleep against his shoulder. Miriam lived to be 81. She died in the spring of 1939, in the stone house in the east-facing room in the morning with her hand in Ethan's. Ethan lived 4 more years and died in the same room in 1943, at 88, on a Tuesday. But those are the endings that come at the end. Long before them, in the ordinary years, on a Tuesday evening in October of 1895, 6 autumns after the sentence in the kitchen, Miriam and Ethan sat at the same pine table with the river-shaped scar in it. The bread was on the board. The stew was on the range. 2 cups of coffee were on the table. Thomas was 4 and asleep on a rug by the stove. Sarah was 2 and asleep against Miriam's shoulder. Outside, the cottonwood ticked at the glass. Ethan looked at Miriam across the table, and he said, "Quiet. I've been thinking on something." Miriam said, "What have you been thinking on?" Ethan said, "Do you remember 6 years ago in this kitchen what you told me?" Miriam said, "I do." He said, "I never gave you the answer I wanted to give. That night. I gave it later at the fence. But not that night." Miriam said, "You gave me a chicken run, Ethan Calloway. That was answer enough." He smiled, small, the way he smiled, which was mostly at the corners. He said, "I've had another answer since. Would you like to hear it?" She said, "I would." He said, "You are not alone. You have not been alone for 6 years. You will not be alone for as long as I am alive to prevent it. And if I go first, I have written Silas, and I have written Reverend Whitfield, and I have written our boy already, though he cannot yet read it, that you are never to be alone again. That is the answer. I've been carrying it a while. Miriam looked at him across the table, and she said only, Ethan. And then she said, sit closer. He came around the table and sat closer. And that is where we leave them. On a Tuesday evening in October, in a kitchen that smelled of black coffee and wood smoke, with a scar in the pine table shaped like a river, and a small boy asleep on the rug, and a small girl asleep against her mother's shoulder, and 2 cups of coffee cooling between them, and no one any longer alone. You who are listening, if there is someone in your life who has been quietly building fences and chicken runs and porch steps for you, who has been riding 4 miles every Tuesday for a dozen eggs they could get at the corner, who has been telling you, in wood and nails and unannounced small labor, the sentence they have not yet found the courage to say out loud. See them. Say the word first if you have to. 10 years is a long time to be alone. 6 months is a long time to be alone. A Tuesday is a long time to be alone, if you are the one counting. Love, the real kind, the kind that does not announce itself, is often standing on the other side of a fence with its hands full of pine boards, waiting to be invited around. Invited around. And if you are the one on the county road side, with your hands full of pine boards, do not wait until February. Do not wait for the fence to fall. Ride the 4 miles this Tuesday, and the next, and the one after, and know that somewhere, on the far side of a paned window, a person you love is learning by the steadiness of your arrivals that they are no longer alone. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, for taking the 4 miles of this story at my slow pace. It means a great deal that you are here. If your heart pulled at any moment in the telling, please leave a small word below. A name, a town, a memory, so I know which parts of the country and which parts of the world are riding with me tonight. And if the story met you somewhere you needed meeting, there is another one already saddled and waiting. The story of a widowed blacksmith in Durango who took in a runaway girl in the winter of 1886, and of the single sentence she said to him at the forge 3 years later that he did not know how to answer either. That one is called She Told Me, You're the Only One Who Ever Stayed, and I Set Down the Hammer. Ride with me into that one next. Until next time, keep riding.